much for having me here, and thank you for supporting independent bookstores and first-time authors. Even just coming out and hearing me makes me feel like sitting around in a room for a year was worth it, so appreciate it. I wanted to start by asking how many people here have been to Bhutan? Are you Joan? Yeah, I knew it. I could tell that it was awesome. So we have a couple of people. Okay, more than usual. How many people here could find Bhutan on a map? Those who didn't go. Well, yeah. Okay, we have a well-educated crowd here, not surprising. How many people here have ever felt kind of stuck with where they were in their lives? Honestly, yeah, my friend raises his hand. Hi. We're all feeling that way, I think, at some point in our lives, especially when we get to a certain point. Well, that's where I was when I met a cute guy at a cocktail party, which is how I got invited to Bhutan. It wasn't a lifelong ambition for me. I could barely find Bhutan on a map. I knew it was in Asia, not in Africa, which is where my father thought it was. I knew that it was a small place and that it was happy because it hadn't had television until about 10 years ago. I figured those two things probably went hand in hand with each other. But I knew very, very little about it. And I was very stuck. I was working at the public radio show Marketplace, which is by all accounts a very nice cocktail party conversation sort of job. But I was feeling like I was 43 at the time, and I just couldn't see myself doing that job for the rest of my life. And I also just didn't know what else to do with the rest of my life. And I was starting to see myself begin to age, and I just really had no idea how to do that gracefully. And then there was the cute guy at the cocktail party who said, I'm a tea importer, and I go all over Asia twice a year to source tea. And I'm going to Bhutan in a couple of days. Would you like to come? And I said, yes, I'll go anywhere with you. Forgetting that I had a job and obligations. So, long story short, I didn't go with him, but a few weeks later he wrote to me and said, how would you like to go to Bhutan to help start a radio station since you're in radio? And I thought, well, that's a great pickup line. But I figured you couldn't make that kind of thing up, as much as a good pickup line as that was. So I said, sure. And then I thought, well, how am I going to do that with this job that I've got? I don't have kids, I don't have a husband, I don't have a mortgage, but I kind of need to figure out how to go do this, because how often does someone offer that kind of opportunity to you? And my mother had always said, don't ever say no, just say yes and then figure out how to do it afterwards. So I did figure it out. My boss gave me a leave of absence, and then I started doing what you would normally do, which is go on Google and figure out a little bit more about this place. And I found out, for those people in the audience who haven't been able to go there, that it was about the size of Switzerland. It had about 650,000 people in it. It was surrounded by Nepal and India and Tibet in the Himalayas. That it was the last Buddhist kingdom. That's why it's called Shangri-La. If you've read the Hilton book, Lost Horizon, from many years ago, that's sort of the prototype, or believed to be the place that they were talking about in that book. And this gross national happiness thing, which, again, I equated with the absence of television till 10 years ago, but it turns out the king of Bhutan in the 70s, when Bhutan was first opening up to travelers, the king said, I don't believe in the gross domestic product. I don't want to measure that about this country as this country opens up to the outside world. I want to measure my people's gross national happiness. And of course, for me as a business reporter with the show Marketplace, I thought, that's pretty cool. He's not worrying about money, he's worrying about well-being. And that sort of phrase has stuck with Bhutan. I'll tell you a little bit more about that afterwards. But that's what I found before I went to Bhutan. That and the fact that that king has 4 wives who are all sisters simultaneously. He married 4 women. Polygamy is allowed in both directions there. So I thought, this is an interesting place. I'll go, doesn't matter. Really what I'm in for. I'm not Christiana, I'm in poor. I don't need it to be a war zone. It's not a war zone. It's a peaceful kingdom. So off I went. And right before I went, the king, that king, abdicated the throne. And it became apparent why this radio station was starting. The radio station was starting because he was laying the foundation for there to be democratic rule. He wanted the people to vote democratically to elect their first parliament. That date would be chosen by the monks and the astrologers, and it wasn't yet determined, but he wanted to resign so that his eldest son, the product of one of these 4 marriages, there were 10 children, the eldest at the time was 27, and he would take the reins, literally, until the parliament was elected, and then power would be divided. So, for the very first time in Bhutan's history. So it became apparent to me as a sort of disgruntled and burnt out career journalist that this radio station wasn't just cute, it was actually seen as an agent of change. It was part of the foundation of democratic rule, which in this country the media are supposed to keep the politics and politicians in check. It doesn't always happen that way, but it seemed very exciting, and further adding to the idyllic nature of this trip was that for me, this was a blank slate, media-wise. The first non-governmental radio station in the hands of the youth. So, off I went to Bhutan, and it was 4 years ago this January that I went for the first time. And the radio station is called Kuzu FM, which is Kuzu Zampola, is hello in Zonka. So Kuzu is hello FM, very quaint. And all I knew is that I had to go help the people at this radio station, which had just gotten up and running, but I didn't really understand what it was they needed from me. And as I flew there, I was wondering what was wrong with me. You know, there I was, 43 years old, and I started feeling sorry for myself instead of excited about the trip. Like, women my age normally go to Disneyland with their kids, or, you know, got romantic weekends with their husband. You know, I'm not even running off with the guy who invited me to Bhutan. I'm just running off to Bhutan because some guy I've never seen again got me invited there. And I was feeling kind of glum, sorry for myself. And then as soon as I landed in the Paro airport, Paro being the place, the location of the only airport, I started to feel that sadness and self-pity melt and dissolve away as I looked out at this great landscape of this place that's only been open for 40 years to tourists and only had roads for 40 years and hard currency for 40 years, and seeing this sort of unadulterated landscape really just affected me from the instant I landed. And I'll read a little passage for you about how I was greeted at the airport by a young woman at that radio station, Kuzu FM, who was to be minding me during my stay. Her name is Nawang Pan. Every mountain and valley was so picturesque, I half expected Julie Andrews to emerge, singing sweetly about the sound of music, except that there wasn't blonde as far as the eye could see. To my American eyes, the ethnic homogeneity of the people was as unfamiliar as the houses, an endless chorus line of humans whose heads were topped with thick, shiny, jet-black hair, close-cropped even for the women, longer for the children. From babes in arms to barely school-aged kids, all the way up the generational line to weathered old men and toothless old women. Regardless of their age, each was wrapped in colorful variations of the national dress, in bright blues and oranges, yellows and pinks. The erratic madness of the road didn't seem to cause concern. Kids sat at the edge of it, older people meandered across it, cows clustered serenely in the middle of it. Even as we whizzed by and stirred up dust and pebbles, both the human beings and the animals went about their business undisturbed. And then there was a visual punchline, adding a bawdy, comic strip-like touch to the landscape. Houses were adorned with giant, brightly colored paintings, sometimes of a rooster or a lotus flower, or occasionally a 10-foot giant winged phallus, wrapped sweetly in a bow. When I found pictures of these online, they'd appeared humorous. Here they seemed ordinary, just part of the scenery. As we drove, Nawang was like a wind-up doll, chattering from the middle row of the van. She narrated the sights. Animals lived on the ground level of a house, she said, and the people one flight above. You could tell we were in Paro and not the capital city of Thimphu because the houses had 3 rows of windows, not 2. From the license plates, you could distinguish whether a vehicle belonged to the government, was a taxi, or was a private car. She had earned a tour guide license, she explained, so if I had any questions, she was equipped to answer them. I had one. What exactly is the meaning of the giant penises? There had been various discussions on the web about their meaning. They weren't fertility symbols, nor were they indicators that prostitutes were available inside, as was the case in other countries. It had something to do with the bawdy mystic named Drukpa Kinley, also known as the Divine Madman, who tamed demons and just about everyone else he came into contact with, using his abundant sexual powers. But the reason for their prominence on the sides of the houses hadn't been properly explained on the internet. Nawang deciphered the mystery. We believe it is wrong to envy what someone else has. When you have a phallus painted on the house, people will be too ashamed to look and to covet what they don't have. In this way, the phallus wards off evil spirits. This had to be the most beautiful, circuitous logic I'd ever heard. I imagine a lot of visitors asked that question, huh? Yes, Nawang said, giggling, lingering on the S for emphasis. They think it's strange. For us, it's just a part of Bhutan. So that was my welcome to Bhutan, and every moment after that, and every trip I've taken back, I've now been 6 times since, I learned something different about myself, but also about this wonderful place that has lived in isolation despite its proximity to these enormous places for many, many years. And I think the fascination for me, besides just the sheer fascination of being in any place that's different than what you're used to, which unlocks something, the fascination for me was that while I was going through this midlife transition and trying to figure out what was next for me, and I knew what I was doing wasn't right, here was this kingdom in this transition, and a very interesting parallel sort of story to mine, as it was sort of becoming a teenager, if you will. It was trying to figure out who it was as it was welcoming in the outside world, literally, both in the form of volunteers and travelers, but also figuratively with the sort of constant inundation that it had with media. Apparently before TV was allowed in, people took satellite dishes and masked them, illegal satellite dishes, and masked them with chilies, which is the staple food of the diet, because they were so crazy to have TV. But once it became legal to have television, TVs were everywhere, out in the open, and the whole frame of reference of life began to change. And it started subtly, but it's now making its way all around the country, even to the most remote parts of this remote kingdom. One example of that is when I arrived, I was staying in a service apartment that's mostly for people who live or are from the outside, expat apartment. And my host apologized for the size of the place, which was about the size of my 1-bedroom apartment in downtown Los Angeles. And I said, really, no, this is perfectly serviceable. It was very adequate, lovely, you know, modest. And he said, no, don't lie to me. I've seen Desperate Housewives. I know what your kitchens look like. And I said, no, my kitchen doesn't look anything like that. But interactions like that every single day just make it clear how much the place is changing, how different it's becoming without people even leaving. And the story is, in addition to the two twin stories of me and this kingdom changing, is this young woman, Nawang Pem, who's 20 years younger than I am, who really felt, as many young Bhutanese people do, especially since they've grown up, their formative, you know, teen years into their early adulthood, seeing both well-off outsiders, because anybody who gets there is well-off, it costs so much money just to fly there, and seeing endless streams of movies and movies and more movies and television. They believe that if they can just get their feet on the ground here in the United States, they're going to be rich. That just doesn't matter what, you know, they're going to live like Desperate Housewives. And no matter how much you explain to them that not everybody back in the U.S. lives that way, they want to see it for themselves, just as we want to go to a place like that. So it's a very interesting time for Bhutan as it transitions with the influence of the media. And this radio station, again, was a fascinating, for me, microcosm, because it was the opposite of Marketplace or your KPBS here, not glitzy at all. It was in an old rundown house. It operated out of a kitchen with a hole in the roof and pigeons cooing, but it really doesn't take a whole lot to make radio. And nonetheless, you had all the youth of Bhutan were so excited about being able to create radio for the first time, And people were so excited to be unified electronically for the first time. It was very populist, this radio station. You could call in and request songs. You could come into the station and ask to have an hour show, like an old college radio station. I want a show about Buddhism. 2 young guys showed up one day and said, the youth are not paying enough attention to the national religion, so you should come on, let us come on, and we'll bring a lama on, and we'll talk about Buddhism every week. And then the next week, a psychiatrist, one of only 2 in the country, ran into the station manager, a high school principal, because there are no media executives in Bhutan, in town, and asked if he could come on the air and do a Doctor is In, sort of Dr. Laura call-in advice chat show. And so this radio station was charming in a way that our media are not any longer, because it's all about money and the bottom line. And remember the days when we had 3 TV stations and everybody knew what was on that night because everybody watched the same things. Of course, remember even further back, if we can, to when there wasn't any television and everybody just talked to each other. And that was the fascination for me about seeing Bhutan as it evolves and gets deeply impacted by the outside world. And I have some other stories I want to tell you. I have lots of stories to tell you, but I'd love to open it up to questions because I find that people ask the best questions about Bhutan. Are there any? Yeah.
What has happened with the politics there since you first arrived? And are you wearing a Bhutanese shawl?
No, unfortunately, I'm not. Sorry, that's just from my aunt, who's not Bhutanese. Italian aunt, not the Irish aunt. I am wearing a Bhutanese wedding ring, though, which I'll show you afterwards. Yeah, so the politics. The parliament was elected in 2008. I went in 2007. They were elected in 2008 in 2 stages. And interestingly, even though the people protested the idea of having to govern themselves, it wasn't like the Middle East. They didn't want the power. They liked the king having the power, which I thought was, PR until I started talking to people. They turned out in force. 80% of the people voted. And even the people who are a significant amount of the number of people are illiterate. And the ballots were printed so that there were pictures and names. And the other reason they needed pictures was because the names are very similar in Bhutan. So you could be Pema Suring and I could be Pema Suring, and we could get married and have a kid that was named Suring Pema or some variation. It was monk-given names, not patrilineal names. So they had to have these ballots with pictures on them because no one could distinguish from the Ugan Suring, this Ugan Suring, and that Ugan Suring. And in almost every case, if a woman was on the ballot, she won. And in almost every case, the elders won. So it was interesting. It was a peaceful transition. Constitution, Bhutan's first constitution was enacted not long after the parliament was seated and signed by all the members of parliament. And parliament was televised in the middle of the day on the only Bhutanese television channel until last year, when the parliament decided that their discussions were too difficult for the average Bhutanese to understand, when they yanked the plug and have been fighting about things like fees that they get for sitting in parliament and their driver's allowances and other crazy stuff. So the parliament went very quickly from being this high-minded, idealistic kind of thing to fighting about important issues. You might have heard about the smoking ban that's going on right now. Cigarettes are illegal to be sold in Bhutan. That doesn't mean that people don't do it. And there's this big loggerhead right now, people trying to bust monks and whomever for buying cigarettes. But yes, so there is a parliament, it's seated, it's fine, but it's sort of devolved into the same level of stuff that we have in our elected officials.
By camera?
Yeah. Yeah.
If you had one statement to make about Bhutan, what would you say is their real strength to people like many who haven't been there?
I think the number one thing that I took away from Bhutan is the spirituality and the sense of community. And, the city where I've spent most of the time I've been there over the last 4 years is changing rapidly. and growing rapidly. But
Thimphu.
Thimphu, yes, the capital city. But when you go out, and even in the city, among the elders, there's a real sense of community and support. You know, gross national happiness, to go back to that, was an ideal that was set forth by the king in the 70s, because the fourth king, because you know, he didn't want the country to become governed only by money. He saw what was happening around him in Asia, and he didn't want to lose his culture or his environment or his sort of social fabric to the almighty buck. So he didn't really mean anything more than the ideal of gross national happiness. He didn't mean happiness per se. He meant well-being. And yet, even though that wasn't a policy that was enforced, people think it is such. It really, there's something about being there where you get the sense, and I really do think it has to do with religious belief. And probably that it's Buddhist, although I think in another place with another religion you might have this too. The sense of people working together and community and belonging, and not I'm going to mow you down in the service of making some money, and I'm going to mow the trees down in service of making some money. So for me, that was a really powerful thing. I mean, living in Los Angeles, working in the media where people literally mow people down to get the story, there was something really powerful for me to see that there was a place where the number one important thing wasn't money or even efficiency. It's not a very efficiently run place. It was really much more in the service of hanging out and being together. The other thing I learned in Bhutan wasn't even from the Bhutanese as much as it was from the other expats I met there. And there were very few there then. Now it's easier to get in there and stay longer as a volunteer. And I felt like the people I met there were unlike anybody I'd ever met before. I had not, you know, I've been around media people my whole life. I worked at the New York Times, worked at MSNBC. I've been around some smart people, but and adventurous people. But there was something about the people in Bhutan who'd gone there to be volunteer nurse or volunteer physical therapist or volunteer English teacher to monks. There was a spirit about them and a sense of believing that there was something more than sitting behind a desk, and a spirit of service that really stuck with me. And everything about being there just helped sort of flip this switch in my life from one of feeling of lack. You know, we're programmed to think about what we don't have all the time, not even just materially, but you know, what we're missing from our lives. And it flipped that switch from a feeling of lack to a feeling of abundance and a feeling of possibility of what could I give. The world seemed like such a bigger place, just being in this very small place, that I could go and be like a woman I met there, Pam, who had been divorced in her late 50s after raising her kids. Her husband had left her for another woman, and she hit the road and has been nursing around the world ever since. When you meet someone like that, who's not self-pitying, but who senses or takes this, you know, difficult situation and turned it into an opportunity, it helps you reframe the way you think, too. That's a long answer, I'm sorry, but I hope that does that. Good. Thank you.
What was your actual job?
Well, so it turns out that I did very little, if nothing, while I was there. And that's very funny for us, right? Because, you know, I'm not a type A person, but I'm a detail, you know, efficiency. I like to get things done. I like to know that I'm helping you out. That I'm useful and needed. Everybody wants to feel part of something. But when I got there, you know, the radio station, I knew the radio station was up and running, that they didn't literally need me to, you know, put up the towers, which is good, because I don't know that I could have done that, although I would have tried to figure out. But it turned out that the sort of blueprint of what they needed from me, helping them figure out an advertising strategy, helping them create programs, they really didn't need that from me. I think that in anybody who's lived in other cultures, especially where they volunteered or worked in NGOs, it's very hard to just, and you wouldn't want to just breeze in and say, this is how we do it back home. We do it this way. But what I ended up doing was being a den mother, really. I would just come to this radio station when the switch went on at 6:30 in the morning and hang out in it all day and first of all, I got so much more out of the experience than they got from me. But I felt like I sort of, at one point, had to say, all right, I'm not going to really contribute a lot here, but I can be, as we all are, an ambassador. I can be the American ambassador, Lisa, who lives, you know, differently than a lot of people in the U.S. do. I thought people would be very surprised by the fact that I didn't have kids. They were more surprised by the fact that I wasn't married. But I can be a sort of walking emissary for the idea that you can live the way I've lived, and you can be an interesting, hopefully thoughtful person who's curious about the world and share who I was, the gift of myself. So, and I got back from the people there the gift of their lives. They welcomed me into their homes. In Bhutan, when you work, you know, I had worked with Marketplace with people for 3.5 years and never met their husbands. And here, people's family members just stop in during the day and drop off lunch or hang out. So I got so much from the culture there, but I felt like I was just giving of my time and myself, and explaining that not everybody in the U.S., I mean, I don't think everybody believed it, but not everybody in the U.S. lived like desperate housewives. And that's what I ended up doing. I did a lot of English pronunciation there. Well, no, and that's a curious thing. A lot of the young people there aren't learning the language, because when the king set up schools 40 years ago, he wisely understood that he needed, if he was going to have people go out for further study, or just even for college, because there's only a couple of colleges there, that he needed them to learn in English. So when the schools were built initially by a Jesuit priest, and then set up beyond that one school that this priest set up in the 60s and 70s, he realized they had to be taught in English. So all of the young people are learning English. Some of them may drop out for economic reasons. Some of them may not test all the way through. School is free. As long as you have a uniform, which is the national dress, but you have to buy a particular one that's particular to your school. So as long as you have shoes and a uniform, you can go to school. And if you can go through 10th grade for free, and then if you pass a certain test, a standardized test, you can make it through 12th grade, and then there's a couple of free schools. So more and more people are being educated. They're being educated in English, and they do learn Dzongkha, the national language, but they don't learn to write it, and a lot of them don't speak it apparently well. So, because it's broken, and they have to take Dzongkha as a subject, but it's not the medium of instruction. So there's a big movement by some of the wise elders there's a new newspaper that just started in Dzongkha, but it's very hard for them to find people who can write in the native tongue. And it's just a big conundrum that the king has created. He's allowed people the ability to go out, but he hasn't really helped them learn the native language. There's Kuzu FM. After about a year, it went national. It was initially just in the capital city, and they started a second frequency, Kuzu Dzongkha. And that's, I can give you the URL so you can hear that online if you wanted to. They broadcast that online. And most of the kids don't want to work for Kuzu Dzongkha. They want to work for the English one. So it's interesting what's happening there. I did not learn the language. That's a long way of saying that. So I can barely speak English. But yeah, it's difficult. I'm not a good linguist at all. Apparently Dzongkha looks like Tibetan. It's similar to Tibetan. And it's a very complex, it's beautiful looking language, and it's beautiful to hear it too. And I can tell when somebody's talking about me in Dzongkha. I can definitely tell what the gossip is. So, yeah.
When you were developing the programming at the news station, at the radio station, did you have a news program?
Yeah, that's a good question. I, of course, being a news person, thought that's cool. Let's, keep the news going. And there was the second in command at the radio station, also a high school administrator, was a media nut. He liked to talk about every morning how he watched King Larry the night before on CNN. And he totally dismissed me until he found out that I had worked early in my career at CNN and the New York Times. That made me golden with him. But he was very committed to there being news. And the problem was, as is the problem in this country, news is a hard thing to execute, because if you don't have people who want to go out, you don't have enough staff to go out and cover the community, it's difficult. But the other problem was that Bhutanese people respect their elders. And so the idea of giving a 22-year-old a microphone and telling them to go to the health ministry and say, what's going on? This is before, I was there the first time before the parliament was elected, much less seated. So the idea of sending someone even to a press conference and asking a question was very terrifying to them. And that was interesting. Again, you know, if you gave the average 15-year-old a microphone or a pen here, they'd be happy to go tell you how much you suck and the government sucks and everybody could. But there, it was difficult. So I did a couple of little classes about who, what, when, where, why, and how, and tried to get people to see what news was. But again, here, the average baby born today will grow up in a media culture and grow up in a news culture. And unfortunately, every damn place they go, they'll see a TV set with a news program blaring. But even in this place where TV had been for 10 years, it doesn't have this just inculcated into them, this idea of a news approach. And just the idea of explaining to the people there that, you know, news is all around you. News, I said when I did this first little workshop, what's everybody experiencing? And they couldn't see that the fact that the stray dog problem was a problem was news, or that kids waiting for the national exam results was news. So yes, they did attempt to do news, and unfortunately what happened was it was reduced to what a lot of news and broadcasting becomes here, which is ripped from the newspaper. And at one point, about 6 months after I left, one woman, who is actually now the star anchor woman, she jumped from radio to TV, wrote the newscast and put the stories. She did a story about taxi problems, the taxi issue, and then the second story was about how the king was touring around some region of the country. And she got in big trouble because the story, even though news-wise she made the right decision, the king wasn't that big a story. It was just like Obama visiting a school somewhere. It's not big news. She was upbraided for not putting that story first, so they yanked the news off Kuzu, and it's never come back. And everybody there was happy because all they wanted to do was play Spice Girls anyway. So it's been troubling. There are now 7 radio stations in Bhutan, whereas just 4 years ago there was that one sort of on the air a few hours a day public-esque radio station, governmentally owned. And there was, when I walked into the country, there was one main newspaper, Kunsel, that had been around for years, and then 2 other startup newspapers, and now there are 7 newspapers. So imagine how much in 4 years. Here, all my journalist friends, including me, don't have jobs, and there, they don't have enough journalists. They don't have people trained. And of course, that's becoming a hot, young career. You know, if you're 20, you want to go get a media degree in India somewhere so you can go work in that world. So again, it's fascinating because 5 years from now, it's going to be a completely different proposition. And already, I'm starting to see young journalists who are eager to sort of muckrake and look into the government. Mm-hmm. Nobody's questioned the royals. That's in the Constitution. You are not to question the royal family, but you can question the parliament, and people are doing that. Prime Minister meets with the media every week or 2 in sort of like a meet the press sort of thing, and people are starting to, you know, investigate, which is good. That's what they want. Yeah.
How has Bhutan avoided becoming invaded by Tibet?
It's an amazing thing that Bhutan has not been invaded. There have been some skirmishes on the borders, but it's just miraculous that it hasn't, and it's not really clear why it hasn't, except that years ago India made good friends with Bhutan, and so India sort of claimed it as its own. It didn't, like with Assam and Sikkim, absorb it. Now it pays, basically the budget in Bhutan would not exist. India funds pretty much all of Bhutan's existence, including the fact that Bhutan's #1 export is hydroelectric power, and that hydroelectric power goes to India. So somehow ways that I've been reading a lot and have not really understood. If anybody here does, I'd love to know it, because it's just a miraculous thing. Some people will cynically say that there really wasn't much to Bhutan it's not, it's a very topographically erratic place. It's very, up in the Himalaya, high in the Himalayas in Yak country by Tibet. Below Tibet, it's very mountainous and rocky, impassable in many places. And then in the southern part, it's green, there's stuff that grows, but for whatever reason, nobody ever saw that as anything worthwhile. In 1914, in the April National Geographic that year, the explorer John Claude White, who was assigned to the government in India from Britain, wrote something about how it's just useless land. So, yeah.
I apologize for coming in late. I hope you didn't answer this, but Bhutan was such a gem of a museum of a Buddhist traditional monarchy, happy people, whatever, traditional dress, even though they had to be forced to wear it. Are all these things that you call signs of progress actually progress, or is that going to spoil the whole museum quality of it?
It's an excellent question. Is Bhutan being spoiled? I mean, I met some people in October in the not the National Museum, the new museum to the monarchy in the center of the country, and they said, oh, we came here from Australia because we know Bhutan's not going to be the same in a couple of years. I mean, if I lived in a village that didn't have a road or electricity, I kind of want road and electricity, right? Wouldn't you?
We would.
We would. And it just makes sense that they would too. Life is easier. I visited a village in October that didn't have a road until 6 months before, and you could already see things changing there. You used to have to walk 2 hours straight up to get to this village. And when you start to think about it, these happy children singing sweetly in the schoolyard of the elementary school, their lives are indelibly changed by that. So I don't know. I mean, it's a really good question, and I thought quite a lot about it, of course, while I was there, while, Spice Girls is pumping out on the radio station, and country music and rock music. But it's a tough thing, They're beautiful. It's beautiful. There is a movement among elders and people in responsible positions trying to preserve the culture. But once you open it up, when the king allowed television in 10 years ago, he said, I know I'm opening a Pandora's box and I'm expecting my people to tread the Buddhist middle path. And of course that's nice and ideal, but tell that to a 12-year-old with a television and an Xbox. So it's tough. It's hard. It's hard. It is changing. It is changing rapidly. Yeah.
Lisa, they had an organization that they hired about a year and a half ago to do an assessment. And it's been absolutely frightening what they recommended to increase the tourism to 100 or 200,000 people.
Yes.
And to essentially commoditize all the sites.
Yes.
And how seriously is the government taking those recommendations?
Well, so the Prime Minister, as you say, about a year and a half ago, decided to hire McKinsey and Company, if anybody's familiar with the consulting firm. And many corporations in the world hire McKinsey to help them, be efficient and maximize their brands and all of that. And basically the Prime Minister said to McKinsey, help me maximize this G&H thing, maximize the Bhutan brand. And part of what he was supposedly doing it for, I haven't talked to him, I don't know the man, but the opposition leader is very vocal and I have talked to him about it. Part of what he was talking about was he needs to develop jobs. So if you go back in time, he's got 40 years ago that the schools started, kids became better educated. They started leaving the country. College degree, as in this country, college degrees became sort of something what you expected, not something only the best and the brightest got. And so more and more people were educated and they needed jobs because they didn't want to go back to the villages to work. And what jobs were they going to get if there's only a certain number of civil service jobs, which 20 years ago were the plum jobs to have, as again in this country the government jobs were years ago. So he's in a bind because he's got this huge population under the age of 30 who don't have jobs. You have gangs forming in the capital city. And he hired McKinsey for much criticism, under much criticism, to help figure out how to make things better in all of the ministries. but particularly how to brand Bhutan with this G&H ideal. So there was lots of criticism among especially from the opposition leader, especially when people found out how much they were paying McKinsey, and I don't remember exactly what it was.
$9 million.
Something like, $9 million, which is a lot of money anywhere, but in Bhutan, magnify that by the exchange rate. That's a lot of money. And people were incensed. They were outraged. And the McKinsey people, mostly young Indian MBAs, came in and studied what was going on. And one of their recommendations, as you say, was to exponentially increase tourism in a completely unrealistic way. It would be like saying, I don't even know how many hotel rooms you have in La Jolla, but saying we want to go from 5,000 beds to 50,000 beds in the next 2 years. There's just no way. So it was it was hugely criticized. One of the other things they recommended was with healthcare, which is free in Bhutan, was to commodify healthcare for outside. Thailand, people go to Thailand to get facelifts. Somebody said, oh, let's have plastic surgery in Bhutan, which is just so obscenely, comically ridiculous. First of all, because the idea of a plastic surgeon, I mean, they can't keep doctors in the country, and there is no plastic surgeon in Bhutan. It's just, right, exactly, there's hardly surgery. So these recommendations were so discordant with the place. It really was, discordant is the only way to describe it. So there was a huge hue and cry among the tour operators. The other thing they wanted to do was to get rid of the $250 a day tourist tax, because they saw that the only way you could get the volume of tourists in, and the tourist tax is a bit of a misnomer because it's not a tax, it's sort of the least you can pay to get into the country. They said get rid of that and open it up and just let everybody come on in. But then someone did the numbers, and the one plane that goes in and out of the country could never have carried all of the people they wanted to bring. So that's an excellent point to your question about politics and how Parliament's doing. It was very widely criticized, but they made their recommendations, and as far as I know, they're out of the country. I was volunteering in the travel ministry while some of those young Indian MBAs were there, and it was fascinating because you have 25 to 30-year-old MBAs, many of them women, telling the guys who run tourism how to do their job, and oh yeah, we should open up those let's open up meditation centers in the center of the country, in a place where people meditate in their homes, at their home altars. It just was obscene. So yeah.
At what point did you decide to write about this topic in the book, and what was the process like?
Good question, thank you. My process was, or my intentions when I first went there were not to write a book. Everybody I worked with said, please bring a video camera, please document this. But I really didn't want to document anything. That's what I was trying to get away from. And when I came back, I was, of course, I couldn't stop thinking about the experience, and it completely transformed, as I was saying before, everything in my world. But I just, as much as I couldn't imagine how I could tell the story. And then I started thinking and talking to people about their sort of midlife transition points. And I realized, it's sort of a stereotype, a single woman in her 40s with no kids. But it wasn't just me. It was married men with kids and happy marriages who got to that point where they went, what if? And everybody seemed to have this pivot point in their lives, this transition point in their lives. And the more I thought about it, I thought, Bhutan is fascinating, and I'm endlessly fascinated by its history and its issues and emerging media culture, but I'm also fascinated by this problem that people seem to face and how they dig out of it, how they get past it. And then I met an agent who had 4 kids, so he had triplet girls. He wanted to put them through school. And we just really hit it off and started working together and writing. I actually went to him initially to write a book about a famous race car driver from 1907, which is funny because that's the year the first monarchy happened in Bhutan. He was coronated, and he said, yeah, that race car driver is great. He might be your sea biscuit, but I'm more interested in the midlife crisis stuff. I've got kids to put through college, so let's talk about it. And so we worked together for 9 months while I was working largely overnights at Marketplace doing the morning show and going into work at 1 o'clock in the morning. I'd get off of work at 9 and come home and write and send emails to Dan, and he'd write back. And 9 months later, fortuitously or not, we had this book proposal which he shopped around the time that the first Parliament was elected. So it was an interesting process, to say the least. But then I had a year to write the book. Yeah.
So, in terms of the book, I'm sorry, I haven't read it yet because I just heard you on
That's
NPR this
okay.
morning.
Oh, good.
So,
Excellent. Radio works. The power of radio.
But is the focus of the book the transformation of Bhutan, or is it the transformation of you?
It's.
Because I'm kind of curious what happened to the cute guy.
It usually takes it took a little longer than usual for someone to ask that question. As a good saleswoman, I should say you need to read the book, but since I'm not, a good saleswoman, hopefully I'm a good storyteller. Nothing happened with the guy, but there's a great chapter in about what happened with him that didn't happen. But no, we're good friends, and on the day the book came out, February 8th, I was in New York with my now boyfriend and the guy, and we all had dinner together. So it was good. But yeah. So it's sort of parallel stories of Bhutan and of me and of this young woman and her sort of experience in the United States. So, yeah.
Can you talk about your adjustment coming back to the United States?
Yeah. Wow. It was really, it's like any sort of culture shock, but culture shock almost sort of reduces it to a cliche. It was so interesting to me how great and big and busy and pristine things were. And I say that living in downtown Los Angeles, which is not pristine in any way. But I had a whole appreciation, a different appreciation for the grocery store and the abundance of stuff that we had. And I'm not a big shopper. I'm a terrible shopper, except for books and food. That's about all I can sort of handle. But I just found myself overwhelmed by consumer culture and by the noise. I really have a hard time, a huge difficult time with the presence of a television screen everywhere we go at the gas station. I was at an acupuncturist a few months ago, and there was a TV screen in the waiting room. And that really hit me, was the not just the volume of people and the craziness of everything, but how big and splendid things were. Because things are not, things are kind of rickety in a lot of ways, and obviously not as huge. So I think that was the number one reaction I had, and especially the first time I went to the Ralphs. It was sort of like, wow, this is kind of amazing how much we have. And of course I knew how much we have, and I've been to other places. I've been to Africa. I've been on safari, walking safari even, but I felt the vastness of what we have. Yeah, I think I felt really, while I was in Bhutan, I think I had this put a fine point on the idea, my mother always says, will it matter in 100 years, or, which is a good question to ask, or how important is this really, and she's never saying it in a belittling way of me, but I know that I'm not the most important person. I don't think the world revolves around me, but it became very apparent when I was there and then when I came home how big the world is and how many people are in it. I mean, the earthquake really puts it in a treacherous, horrible, I just want to cry kind of way. I just feel the sense that we're connected much more, and some people might think that's a little bit too flighty or fruity or whatever, but I really felt a sense of connectedness to people in a different way than I ever had before, just from getting on a plane and going to live in another place for a while. And being a minority in that place was a really important thing too. I think I felt that about returning to Los Angeles and how diverse a community it is, and how much I appreciated that. So it was a mix of feelings. Yeah.
How long was your first trip to Bhutan?
First trip was just 6 weeks, and then I've been there 6 times, as I said, over the last 4 years, and the longest time I've lived there was 2.5 months. So it's hard to stay. They wanted me to come for 4 months, and I was too chicken to go for 4 months. Partially because I was afraid about losing my job, because I knew the minute I left, which is what happened, the minute I left they hired someone 15 years younger for a lot less money. Not that I was making a lot. So I was still in that transition point when I first went. And then when the book got sold in proposal form and I had to write it, I went back and lived there for the longest stretch that I've been there. So yeah, we're not talking about years. You can have a transition in a short period of time. Yeah.
I was just wondering, in Bhutan, what was the reasoning behind finally allowing television to occur?
The king has never said why. It was on, I think it was National Day in 1999. He made a speech. And he allowed in the internet and television at the same time. And of course, the internet was in a different place than it is now. And the place, Bhutan, was in a different place electricity-wise. So it wasn't like everybody was going to run out and get a personal computer because the internet was allowed. But he allowed both those forces in at the same time. And literally the next day, TV station switch was flipped. And he'd been preparing it had been being prepared behind the scenes. And again, people had been sent out. The best and the brightest were sent out to make sure this television station worked. But he's never said why. I suppose that what it was is that he saw the writing on the wall, to use a cliche. He knew if he was sending more and more people were being educated and going out to school, that he couldn't have them come back and go, wait, we're missing this television thing. So he did it in a way that he could control it. By letting this Bhutan Broadcasting Service form and letting in, at first, just a few outside television stations. The guy seems almost too good to be true, especially when you look at Gaddafi and all the other stuff that's going on in the world, that he was prescient enough to say, wow, I got to educate my people, I got to give them roads, I got to have health care for free, I got to, create a currency, and I've got to let in people because I can't keep them out anymore. I think that there's something really almost otherworldly about somebody who is that wise. Yeah.
Did you talk about the expulsion of the 100,000 Nepalese?
Yes, thank you for asking about the Nepali refugee situation, because it's important, and there's irony in the title Shangri-La and Happiest Kingdom on Earth, which some people don't know because you can't know it until you read the book. So I write about globalization and the impact of media culture on this place, but long before I went to Bhutan, there was a refugee situation that was created. I'll step back a little bit. So in the 70s, again, what happened is Bhutan was modernizing. They realized if they were going to offer free health care and free education, they needed to give people citizenship ID cards. I'm 47 now, people 40 and older many of them don't know their birth dates because there were no birth certificates, because babies just got born and got raised and went to work on the farm, the family land. So until about 40 years ago, there were no birth certificates, and there was no need for them. There was really no need for birth certificates. And the borders are porous in that area, or they were more porous back then. And Nepali people in particular came in or were brought in to do jobs that people there didn't want to do, like build the roads, like be maids, housekeepers, because where they were was so crowded and poor, and coming to Bhutan was a picnic in comparison. I use that word very facetiously. So you had a growing Nepali population, and you had these ID cards being issued, and what Bhutan did was say, you're Bhutanese, but you're not. Even though the Nepali people had been there the way my immigrant Italian grandfather was here for close to 100 years before he passed away and was granted citizenship there, that wasn't the case. The people were not granted citizenship. They weren't grandfathered in. They were kicked out. And some people were, there was some sort of violence that's not really clear to me exactly what happened, but there was a problem. They didn't behave in the most Buddhist way, to put it mildly, and people were kicked out. And it's not clear, it didn't appear to be that it was 100,000 people at the time, but again, I wasn't there. This is all stuff I've read and tried to synthesize from talking to people and understanding what happened. But people were put out, and Nepal wouldn't take them back because they hadn't lived in Nepal. I mean, there had been generations of people living in Bhutan, so Nepal didn't take them back. They didn't absorb them, and they languished in refugee camps, 7 refugee camps on the border for many, many years until a couple of years ago. And the numbers increased because people were living in these refugee camps, babies were born. So that's why the numbers are squishy. It's not entirely clear. Some people seem to think it was 60,000 or so people who actually got expelled. Nonetheless, people were expelled and living in these camps. And 2 years ago, a number of them, it's about 60,000 that have been repatriated so far, most of them, many of them, to the United States. In almost every community I go into, probably this is one where there are not many. I was just in Tucson this weekend, and there's a number of people who come out to hear me talk who were teaching English to refugees. And it's a really fascinating and interesting and terrible part of their history, of the Bhutan's history, and it's an interesting thing that we have these new citizens who have to absorb into our culture. It's been very difficult for a lot of people, as you can imagine, because they don't have any job skills. Living in this country is not easy under the best of circumstances, but many church groups have welcomed people, and so that's a dark side of their history.
I heard that part of the reason was they refused to wear the Bhutan national dress.
Part of the reason they refused to wear the national, well, it's more the inverse. So in that time, the national dress, which is a kira for the women and a go for the men, and Joan's got these beautiful boots on, you can see later on. It's a beautiful national dress, which also was a very simple dress. People just had a big piece of fabric that they wrapped around them, and that was all they wore for a long time. Because it took a year to make one before there was any sort of imports. People wore this national dress, or were told to wear this national dress, and some Nepali people feel that that dress code was enforced, again, to distinguish the Nepali people from the Bhutanese people. So it wasn't so much that they were expelled because they wouldn't wear it, it's just that that wasn't their dress, so it identified them as non-authentically Bhutanese. And even today, kids, when they're born, have to have two parents who have Bhutanese citizenship ID cards, except if you're well off. And if you're well off, somehow you can marry their intermarriage is not common there, but if you have a Danish NGO worker who falls in love with a Bhutanese person, somehow those kids make it under the radar. But if you marry a Nepali person, not so much. So it's an interesting double standard, and it's an interesting form of racism there, again, because it is a devoutly Buddhist culture, and if you know even this much about Buddhism, you know that Buddhism is one love. We're all in it together, so it's very, again, discordant. Yeah?
Did you ever meet the gal that wrote the book, the one that went there to teach?
Yeah. So there's a book that was published about 12 years ago called Beyond the Sky and the Earth by Jamie Zeppa. It's a beautiful book, and it's completely different and similar to mine in the way that my book is like Eat, Pray, Love, but bears no resemblance to it, in that it's about a woman's journey in Bhutan when she was 24, pre-television, pre-internet, pre-electricity. And no, I have not met Jamie Zeppa. She just published a novel. She just published a novel in Canada, which is where she's from, and I'd love to meet her, but I've never had the pleasure.
Didn't she marry a
She actually married a Bhutanese man who was, for a long time, and on an election night, the sort of key, he was like the Dan Rather of Bhutan, and he also stars in that film, Travelers and Magicians. If you've seen that, a lot of people who've gone to Bhutan have seen it. It's sort of like, it's a wonderful life for Bhutanese, and it's a beautiful movie, made by, just to do all the intermingling, and this is like my little PhD in Bhutan. If you know Zongsar Khyentse Rinpoche, who is a renowned Rinpoche, a Lama in Buddhist culture, he made Travelers and Magicians, and he also wrote a book called What Makes You Not a Buddhist, which is a very populist book about Buddhism for people who are not necessarily practitioners and are not Bhutanese. So it's an interesting intermingling of characters there. Yeah, Sewang.
But they did get divorced.
They did get divorced, but they had a baby. Not to give away the story. Yeah, but I just
when you describe the destruction of Bhutanese culture and that, are you upbeat about it or are you downbeat on it?
Well, by training I'm a journalist, so I'm sort of neither. Again, I'm not. I'm sad. I'm sad in our culture, our melting pot of cultures, to see what television has done for all of us, and what consumer culture has done for all of us. That really distresses me a lot here, and I spend a lot of time thinking about it and talking about it. So I certainly feel the same way in Bhutan when I see young people wanting designer goods just because they're designer goods and they can't afford them and they want them anyway. So I feel distressed when I look in Bhutan and I see people coming illegally into this country to be nannies, to send back money so their families can build big houses, just because why not build a big house? So I feel, yes, that it's disturbing to watch it. I don't know how exactly I convey it in this book. I guess I feel, you know, it's part of what's happening. I don't know how you stop it. I spend a lot of time thinking about how do we stop it here without shutting down the system in the world, and I don't have any answers, but it's a complex problem. But I definitely observe it, you know, lots of pop culture references. I don't own a television, and I don't see a lot of movies, so when I got there and everybody assumed the American gal would be able to answer all their questions about, you know, here's another sort of tangential thing to your question. I was in this very remote spot in eastern Bhutan in October, and I walked up to the school up a road with my friends who are Bhutanese. We got to the school, and these little kids ran up to me. They'd never seen an American before, an outsider, a white person. And so it was fun. They were mobbing me. It was really cute. And I got the teacher to pull out a map. And I said, okay, show me where Bhutan is on the map. I said, who knows where the United States is on the map? And they found it. And I said, I live in California. And they all looked very quizzically. And the teacher, who was probably about 25, 30, said, California, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yeah. And the kids looked at him, and they didn't know Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then he said, Terminator Part 1, Part 2, and the kids went, oh, yeah. So, I mean, it's a, you know, I don't know what to say about it. It's a complex problem, way bigger than all of us. There is a woman there who's a big media literacy advocate who figures, okay, we have a pure slate here. We had one. Let's teach people how to read and parse the media so that they don't just absorb everything coming at them. But I think she's fighting an uphill battle. I hope that answers your question.
So you touch on the globalization of media.
Oh, yeah. I think that's sort of the whole basis of the book. And again, it's not, you know, the Nepali refugee situation, but it's a different sort of troubling thing.
Because there's a number of issues. I mean, the reason for the ID card or the birth certificate is because when a person gets a birth certificate in the world, they're actually registered on the stock exchange. So each American who has a birth certificate is registered on the stock exchange, and you're traded as a commodity. So what happens is within Thailand and within Asia, there's been a move to give identity cards to indigenous tribes. So they've been going throughout the Golden Triangle and handing out ID cards to people who are, you know, literally Stone Age people. So I'm working with people who are in Thailand who've never seen money in their lives, but they have a laminated identity card because it creates a stock exchange commodity. There's a share certificate for every person in the world who has a birth certificate, and it's traded on the markets.
Fascinating. I had, as a longtime business reporter, had no idea, but I'd love to hear more about that.
It's fairly simple. Just look up birth bond on Google.
No question. Yeah. Oh, he's talking about a commodification of humans by giving people ID cards, and he says they're traded on the stock exchange or allied with the stock exchange. I'm sorry. I'm just mindful of the clock. What time do you need me to stop?
We can take a few more questions.
Couple more questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
What was your publisher's real excitement about your book when you brought in the concept?
Well, so when we went to sell the book in March of 2008, we were lucky enough to have 5 publishers interested, and that's a wonderful problem to have. And I absolutely am sure that I benefited from Elizabeth Gilbert's book. I think people saw this as, even, you know, it was 80 pages that I had written as a proposal, and there were no conclusions. They were all curious what happened with the guy. And I said to my agent, no one will buy this book because I don't run off and marry this guy. They're going to be, it's not Hollywood enough. But they were interested in it, I think, because they saw that there's an endless appetite. You know, happiness was, I don't think, in the title when we sold it, but happiness books are big. People are looking, I start the book with an exercise in 3 good things, positive psychology. I took it in LA before I went, the whole idea of listing before you go to bed every night, the 3 best things that happened to you that day, no matter how seemingly insignificant they are. So I think that there was a movement for, people love travel memoirs, you know, going places that they don't ever go. And I think, or might have gone, and they want to see what someone else's perspective is on it. And the other exciting thing for me in my 40s was that women apparently are the #1 book buyers. Women in their 40s and 50s are the the chief book buyers. So that was one industry where I wasn't becoming obsolete. So I think that's why. Yeah.
Can you talk about what you're doing now, something about a library?
Yes, thank you for asking about that. Yes, I often sort of work that in, and I forgot to so far. So one of the main things I'm doing right now, besides going out and promoting this book, because I won't make any more money on it, the bookstore will, which is why I hope you buy it, is that I'm trying to help build a library in that part of the country that I was just describing, Mangar district. And what I and several friends, a couple of whom are Bhutanese, are doing is working with Read Global, which is a Bill Gates initiative, Bill and Melinda Gates initiative, to build libraries in underserved countries. And what's cool about doing that, as opposed to doing it in South Central, which I would love to do, but it's a little bit more expensive, is that for $50,000, we can build a library in a place that needs it. And just to put a fine point on it, I met a kid who told me he had 18 books, and that was more books than anybody else he knew. So books are hard to come by there, and especially the further out of the capital city. There was, until last year, only one library in the whole country, a lending library, and that was in Thimphu. So some of the schools have the books on this pillar right here, about as many books as they'd have in a typical school library. And there's not a big culture of lending books, because parents are afraid that if you take that book home, you might destroy it, and they'd be responsible. And some of the elders, especially in the hinterlands, are illiterate, and so they don't get the whole book thing. They're a little scared of it. So Read Global just built its first library in Ura, which is in the center of the country. It's a beautiful place. It's not a luxe place. It's an old farmhouse with no plumbing, but it's a library with shelves and books, and kids go there every day because there was nowhere else to go, and they're able to borrow books. And they had the staff had to convince the parents, yes, you should let your kids take home these books.
But they're watching TV.
And pardon?
But they're watching TV.
But they're watching TV too. But at least they're also taking home books. And I made the kids all go get their favorite books off the shelves, and it was a wide variety of things. So they actually do read them. They seem really into it. And that's what we're trying to do. And if anybody has any brilliant ideas about how to get books over to Bhutan, that's the big problem. Everybody wants to give us books, but we don't know how to transport them yet. So we have to figure that out. But in the meantime, we're trying to just raise money and raise awareness that you can build a library inexpensively in another place. And what Read Global is doing is fantastic.
Books in English?
Yeah.
They can read
They'd love English books. Yeah.
In Malawi, here, the church sends people there to the religious groups, but they all are obligated in a way to carry like 15, 20 books in their suitcase. And that would be a good way. I'm sure people could take them. If you knew who was going in that one airplane going in.
Great idea. No, and in fact, I'm unwittingly following your great idea, because of course at these readings I constantly meet people who are going to Bhutan, and I always say, just stuff your pockets filled with a couple of books and bring them to this Sewang Zam, who is the public librarian, who must think I'm some crazy guardian angel or something, because people are always showing up, and I'll get an email from her. Thank you for sending Madam so-and-so with books. And she's just thrilled to get anything. So I have to figure out how to direct that more specifically toward this initiative. So.
And one of the things that I found is, like, you probably know about Tariana.
Yeah, Tariana Foundation.
The Queen's Foundation. Mm-hmm. And it's so hard to get I've been trying to fundraise for them, because they work with the poorest of the poor.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But because none of our companies were in there, they say we only give money to India and China
Yes.
because they buy our products.
Yes.
So that's a major problem, and I talked with the ambassador in the United Nations the other day. He said the foundation, the Bhutan Foundation, is having the same problem.
Yes.
How can we break through that barrier?
It's a difficult problem, which is why I used to give to the Bhutan Foundation, which was sort of the U.S.-based nonprofit that was sort of an agent to give money. I had a scholarship going at the radio station for a while, which is, $1,000. You can send a kid to school there. It's amazing. But it is a problem, and I'm happy to talk about it with you offline. But that's why I loved finding Read Global, because they're an established nonprofit, and when they opened up their presence in Bhutan, it just makes, they have a U.S. presence. They're a 501c3. The money's getting there. I mean, the first time I put a kid through school, I had to wire money to some guy I'd never heard of in some bank account, it was just very strange. And I know the kids went because the next time I went to Bhutan, they came to thank me, which was just unbelievably lovely. But it's an interesting thing. And again, it goes back to the fact that this is an undeveloped place in so many ways, and it's not like, earthquake relief to Japan where you just call the Red Cross and give money.
Yeah.
So, are we?
That's about it.
Yeah, I think because we're 8:41 and you guys gotta go.
You want to make sure you can sign some books?
Yeah, I'd love to sign some books, and thank you so much. And I have cards up here with my email address and website. I've got lots of video online if you're curious to see it. And I'd just love to hear from you about what you think. And thank you so much for your time and attention.